Well, good morning to everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. Those of you who are part of the faith family, I have to remember to stay within the camera, right? So, yes, I'll hang on. Oh, so I do want you to know that if I may be a bit wobbly, I did not dip into communion early this morning, just to let you know. My foot in the bedpost got in a fight.
Oh, no.
And guess who won?
The bedpost.
Absolutely. So I am still recovering from that, and we'll see what happens later today when I visit with the podiatrist. So pray for healing for me if you don't mind. This is my passion, burnout and secondary trauma, and it started 30 years or more ago. And it started because my husband was a pastor. Imagine that you would experience burnout being a pastor. And I was very concerned with what was going on with him. I saw a large amount of discouragement. I saw some depressive symptoms. I saw some anxiety. And I thought, oh gosh, what's he going to do if he can't pastor? How is he going to make money? See, that's what I was really worried about. Well, once he, I thought, oh brother, what am I going to do? I have babies. So that's when it began. But then when I got into the field and I began to do both, well, first counseling and then some ministry, I also experienced burnout about 5 years into my counseling practice. And I also experienced some compassion fatigue. And I thought, well, what am I gonna do? Because here I am with a bachelor's in psychology, which you can't do anything with that. And I had a master of divinity. What was I going to do? Where would I go? So I had to find my way through. Fortunately, at the time, it was 1998, which you remember was just a few years after the Oklahoma City bombing. And my husband said, I've been invited to a retreat. My husband had been a responder to the Oklahoma City bombing. And he had gone there and was basically placed in a church where families were waiting for news of their family members. So he was bringing comfort and care, and then at times was with them when they received news of their loved ones that was not good news. So he had been invited to this debriefing retreat. The FBI had contacted Charles Bigley, who basically was the leading expert in traumatology at the time. And Charles had a student named Eric Gentry. And Eric and his colleagues had developed an accelerated recovery program for compassion fatigue. So my husband said, why don't you come with me? And I did. And in the midst of that retreat, when I was sharing some of what I was experiencing, Eric looked me straight in the eyes and said, you have compassion fatigue. And I knew it was true because of what he'd been talking about. But it was a new term, and I didn't know too much about it. And the next thing he said changed my life. He said, that's because you were doing the job so well. How wonderful was it to hear that? That's because you were doing your job so well. So I began that process of recovering from burnout and compassion fatigue, and incidentally have kept up with Eric and recently did a 2-year training with him to become a professional resilience coach and consultant. So that's been my journey, and I think it's important for you to know that I have been through that process. Because until you have experienced burnout or secondary trauma, then it's hard to talk about what it is that you experience and why we should be concerned about it. And so we're going to skip this. This is the agenda for today. When I was preparing for today, I wanted to specifically look at ministry leaders. And so I found a very recent survey. And the voices, it was both in case some of you are interested, it was a mixed study survey. So it included both qualitative research, which means the stories and asking people of their stories. And then it also included data. So in other words, survey information. So here are two of the remarks made from just two ministry leaders. Everything. I am exhausted. People have moved away from the area, and new folks are fewer and farther and slower to engage. Our regular volunteers are tired and overwhelmed. Everyone is reevaluating their commitments. They are less engaged overall and very unwilling to make year-long commitments. Some folks aren't interested in even making one-off commitments to engage with community service, participation in worship leadership, or any other volunteer experience at church. And he was asked, what is enlivening about ministry? Nothing that I can think of. Ooh. And in 22 years at this church, this has never happened before. Let that sit with you for a moment. And here's the second pastor. The post-pandemic turnover has left our lay leadership depleted. People's sense of connection and commitment is less than before. It's hard to get people to do DIY church in the way that we did before. People seem to be more demanding of services. Plus, people's doubt is at an all-time high. I'm spiritually exhausted from talking people back into faith. Am I even doing them a favor? Ouch, right? That's concerning. And so as I read those voices, and there were many more, I thought of what the Jews said when they returned to Israel and saw the devastation after their Babylonian exile. And here they were grieving, and they wanted a display of God. They wanted God's assurance that He was there for them. And so they said, as fire kindles brushwood, as fire causes water to boil, make your name known to your foes, so the nations may tremble before you. I love this passage and all the imagery it has. When you did awesome things that we were not expecting, you came down, the mountains shook at your presence. From days of old, no one has heard, no ear perceived, no eye has seen God, except you who acts on behalf of the one waiting for Him. You meet Him who rejoices in doing righteousness, who remembers you in your ways. Behold, you are angry. When we keep sinning all the time, would we be saved? For all of us have become like the one who is unclean, and all our unrighteousness is like filthy garment. And all of us wither like a leaf, and our iniquities carry us away like the wind. No one calls on your name or stirs himself up to take hold of you. And it continues on, O Adonai, show yourself to us. And I thought about how those sounded so similar and how these were people who loved God, who needed to experience a renewal of freshness of God's presence. And I think that is certainly true. So to show you further, from this same study, which was the Hartford Institute for Religion, this compares, first of all, those ministry leaders who seriously considered leaving their congregation between spring 2021. So if you look to the right, you'll see the light blue. So those who seriously considered leaving were about 6%, compared to 10% last fall. Those who thought about it once or twice or more were 15% compared to, look at that big jump in 23, 34%. And then those who seriously considered leaving ministry in totality. In 21 of spring, 8% considered leaving ministry, compared to 23, 13% considered leaving. And then compared to those who thought about it once or twice, maybe more, 29%. And then increase to 40%. So that shows you the level of discontent that clergy ministry leaders are experiencing. And this is just another part of the survey that looked at some of the similar facets. So they considered both leaving their congregation or ministry. 1/3, 34% of ministers are thinking about leaving. So I'm very particular when people begin to complain about my pastor. Now, I don't necessarily always agree with everything my pastor says, and sometimes his sermons are really right on check, and sometimes I think, I don't know about that. I'm just like a normal person. I critique everyone, right or wrong. But what I also keep in mind is my pastor is a human being, and he is doing his very best. And I don't want him to be in that 34%. And so I will do whatever it takes to support him and the rest of the ministry staff. I get to have lunch with him today, which is wonderful. And find another way to support him. So when we talk about burnout, and when we talk about secondary trauma, we're really kind of talking about two different things. And I want to make sure we're clear about those, because sometimes people use the word compassion fatigue and they talk about burnout. That's particularly common in the medical field. And even in research studies, they often use the word compassion fatigue when really it's not compassion fatigue, it really is burnout. And I'll explain why in a moment. But because in the behavioral health field, we consider compassion fatigue as the same, if not similar, at least, to secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. And the reason why they should be separated, burnout does not require empathy in order to occur. A person can burn out because of the environment they work in. Now, they may have some individual characteristics, which we'll talk about in a moment, but if they work in an environment that might be particularly toxic or unhealthy for them as an individual, they can burn out, whether or not there's empathy involved. However, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, or vicarious trauma, typically most consider that it is an empathy-based stress or strain that occurs. Now I say most because there are some researchers that would agree that empathy has to be involved, but I'm going to tell you about probably 90% of the researchers will say Those are empathy-based conditions. So as we continue to talk, you're going to see me switch between burnout and secondary trauma, and from this point forward, I'll just really use the word secondary trauma, because meaning all three of those, because it's easier. So burnout and secondary trauma is what we'll begin to talk about. So burnout. I mentioned that there are some individual characteristics, and if you look down to the right on this slide, you'll see those individual characteristics. So when the study of burnout first began, in fact, the first book written on burnout was written by Herbert Freudenberger, and it was written and published in 1980. I had recently graduated from college. I purchased that book. I had no idea why. I wasn't particularly interested. I didn't even know I was going to be a therapist. I purchased that book. I tucked it away. I don't even know that I read it. I tucked it away, and then probably 20 years later, when I was reading about burnout, I went, oh, I think I have that book. And sure enough, I had that book. Who knew? You know, God inspired that. So the individual characteristics that typically tend to be related or put a person at risk for burnout, and they use the word neuroticism. I don't like the word neuroticism because that sounds very demeaning. That means usually when we talk about neuroticism, we're talking about a person who tends to be more of an anxious person. They worry a lot, okay? They seem to be unsettled. It's also a person, and we use the word, in behavioral health, we use the word external locus of control. That just means that I need external resources or people or things to tell me I'm okay, I'm doing a good job. So I'm more dependent upon things outside of myself to give me that okay. It also is people that experience what we know is alexithymia, or people that have difficulty naming and stating their emotions. How about type A? Now that should not be a surprise to you, right? Type A personality would be at risk. And those that use emotion-focused coping. In other words, they just try to work on their emotions and change their emotions. Okay? But here's what the researchers discovered. So the original researcher, Christina Maslach, thought, you know, I don't like how this places the role and responsibility on the individual solely. And indeed, we can take an individual and we can try in as much as possible to alter all of these. We can give them all the best coping skills in the world. But if we introduce them back into an environment that is not healthy for them, they will still burn out again, or they will remain burned out. And that is when she and her colleagues identified there were other environmental factors that place a person at risk. And here those are, and you're going to recognize these in ministry. Work overload, working too many hours, having too many responsibilities, having too many different roles, having a conflict in your role. In other words, when I used to with the school counselors, I said they had to be both disciplinarian and tell a student they were suspended, while at the same time they are trying to build rapport with a student. There's a conflict there. If a church is in the practice of disciplining a member and counseling a member, there's a conflict there to some extent. Okay? So it also includes a lack of autonomy. So if a person does not have the degree of autonomy that they need. Now, I know we all think that, at least in the congregation, the pastor makes all the decisions, right? And he has, or she has, sole autonomy. That's not true. Because we also know whether it's outwardly known or not, there is an internal power system within the church. And so there are people that have been there for generations, or their family have been there for generations, so you knew that sign on the back of the wall in the church, You're going to hear about it. You made that piano. You just sort of angled it slightly different. You're going to hear about it. Yeah, I can tell. Those of you who are a little older, you know what I'm talking about. You know that sign that had the number on the had the numbers on the back of the church wall. So that's just to say that a lack of autonomy or ability to decide when and how and where I work is a risk factor. Inadequate supervision or perceived injustice. I do not feel a sense of reward or appreciation, or there's something about, so I'm going to tell you about an injustice, and that was my husband, who was paid when he entered the ministry, and we started a church, and he was paid $1,000 a month for salary, and then he had to pay taxes out of that on his own as self-employment. That was unjust. Thank you, Nancy. That was unjust, even so long ago. Fortunately, thank the Lord, there were people who came and provided for us. How about the poor working hours? Anybody know any ministry leaders that have ideal hours, 9 to 3? Right? And emotional labor. So emotional labor is that energy that I put forth, like what I'm putting forth right now. Now I'm going to tell you, and this may surprise you, I am an introvert. I like to be alone. That's where I get my energy. So when I go out and I present or I'm interacting with people, that is emotional labor. That requires a certain amount of energy, and I love to do it. But it is draining. And so when you're in a ministerial role and you have to be nice to people that maybe you don't want to be nice to at that moment, you know, maybe they have said something to you like, well, you don't really preach like Billy Graham. And you go, well, thank you for your feedback. That's emotional labor, and that places you at risk. And then if there's a lack of perceived social support. So if in your setting, wherever you work, you perceive that you're not receiving the support you need, that places you at risk. So sometimes burnout occurs because there's a mismatch between the person and the job, a person's values and the organization's values, or a mismatch between the person and the type of work they were asked to do. Okay? Now, here's the difference with secondary trauma. Here's where it begins. So, a ministry leader who is exposed to trauma through listening to a story of trauma from a person that they are caring for, or through walking with a person through their trauma. For instance, right now I do free counseling for my church, and so I am helping a young woman who is walking through her husband's cancer diagnosis, and it's up and down constantly. It's very depleting for her, and so I am watching this trauma unfold. It's not happening to me, but it's exposing me to trauma by walking with her through it. To which we have what we call an affective empathic response. In other words, we care, we feel for people. That's natural. And I believe that we were created that way. Now, the degree to which we experience what we call compassion stress is dependent upon a few things. First of all, it's dependent upon what we call self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is many things, but I've mentioned at least 4 here. And that is the ability to self-regulate. So in other words, if I feel intense emotion, can I moderate or modulate that? If it's on high, like a high volume, can I bring that down to a medium volume? Or detachment. Now, I don't mean that I am totally detached from a person, but rather a healthy detachment where I'm able to recognize that the pain they experience is not my pain. Okay, I'm able to separate it out. And then those personal characteristics that I mentioned before are part of the picture. And then if a person is not taking care of themselves, and we're going to come back to self-care a little bit, but I want you to see it's a piece of the picture. Okay? Now, the other factors that contribute to whether compassion stress is experienced and the degree to which it's experienced is, and I really put the wrong word here, it shouldn't be low job satisfaction. It should be, I'm not feeling like my job is rewarding me as much as it did in the past. I don't feel as much satisfaction or compassion satisfaction. So I went into it and I felt good about helping people. I don't really feel like my cup's getting filled so much anymore. Or if some of those systemic factors that I mentioned are present, or I have a lack of support, then those things are what can cause compassion stress to increase and increase and increase. And if I have prolonged exposure, which in the ministry you will have prolonged exposure to people who suffer with trauma, and if you have any life stressors, anybody in the room not have any life stressors? Okay. And if you have traumatic memories, in other words, this could be of your own that you experienced in your life, or it could be that you have counseled someone in the past who had some type of trauma, and then when you're counseling another person, all of a sudden the memories flood in of that other person. So all of those contributing factors then will lead to secondary trauma or compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. And that leads us to talk about empathy. And there are different types of empathy. But first, empathy. Empathy is where we begin in ministry. We do this work because we care. I dare say that anybody in this room, if I asked you, you're here for the money. Okay, probably not. You're here because, it boosts your ego. I don't think so. The ministers and ministry leaders that I meet, they're here because they have a heart for the world. That's why you're here. But empathy is a double-edged sword. While it helps us to care and relate to people, it can also potentially cause harm to us. And that's what we really want to look at. Okay? So when I thought about empathy and what is experienced when I have empathy, I thought of the woman who went out in public. She wasn't supposed to be out in public. She was an unclean woman. She went into the crowd and touched the hem of Jesus' cloak. It's crowded. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are confused. His disciples are thinking, everybody's touching everybody. It's a crowd. How could you know that someone touched you? And Jesus says, I know someone touched me because I felt power has gone out from me. Right. And that's what happens when we have empathy. We lose some power. Oh. So here are types of empathy. First is what we call affective empathy, and some argue we don't have a choice, that we automatically experience affective empathy by virtue of what are known as mirror neurons. I don't think we can prove that. What we can say is that there is some research that says that we do have mirror neurons, and they happen to be in the same place in the brain that shows where we experience affective empathy. And mirror neurons are like It's like a mirror. If I observe someone who's in pain, we know it's especially true of physical pain. If I observe you're in physical pain, and I feel close to you or have a deep concern about you, I may also experience some physical pain. Perhaps not to the degree that you experience it, and perhaps not the same type of pain, but I experience it. Okay? So that's affective empathy. Jesus experienced affective empathy. I thought of one example that I believe Jesus experienced affective empathy. And John 11:35. Anybody know what that one is? Jesus wept. Mary comes to him and tells him about Lazarus, and Jesus wept. And I think in that very moment, Jesus' heart broke, that he might have experienced what Mary was experiencing. Now, Jesus went and resurrected Lazarus, but at that moment, that was affective empathy. Now, cognitive empathy is the ability to understand what another person experiences. And so that might be, an example of that for Jesus might be in Luke 4, when he goes and he begins to preach from Isaiah 61, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord has come upon me and anointed me to bring good news. Because there is an understanding there that I see you're in pain, I see that you're hurting, and I'm here to help you. In other words, I understand your pain. I'm not feeling it, but I understand and I want to help you with it. And then there is compassion, or you might call it empathic concern. And compassion for Jesus, I think, would be in Matthew 20, when the two blind men come to Jesus. I think it's 20:34, and they say, Lord, heal us. And it says, Jesus having compassion. It actually uses that word, Jesus having compassion. Okay? So, to help you understand the difference between these three, there are usually three questions I ask. When you experience empathy, whose pain are you feeling? Is it your own pain? Or is it the pain of the other person? So that's called self-other distinction. Are you able to distinguish between their pain and your pain? If you cannot distinguish, that's affective empathy. The second question I ask is, do you feel similar pain that they feel? Because that's called isomorphism. And so if it's isomorphism, that's affective and might be compassion, but not cognitive empathy. And the third question I ask, is there some compulsion or need to do something? Affective empathy, there may or may not be a need to do anything. Cognitive empathy, typically there's not a need to do anything. Sociopaths have cognitive empathy, but they cannot feel the pain of another person, and they will not act to help another person. But they understand what pain is. Compassion is a desire to do something about it. So what we can say when Jesus in Luke 11:35, John 11:35 weeps, he then moves from affective empathy quickly and goes into compassion because he does something about it. So just to show you, and I don't want to get too in-depth about the neurobiology, but I just want to show you, because for a long time we thought, well, this is just a play on words. You're just using words to describe different things. Well, maybe not. So, switching back to burnout, we have to go back to stress and how stress affects the brain. So, I'm going to show you my fist here. Make sure I get it in the camera. My fist is a approximately the size of half of my brain. You can see there. And this part is what you see here. Okay, this is the spinal cord leading up. It has something called the pons and medulla, etc. This is what keeps me breathing, keeps my body functioning, keeps me alive. Then I have this part, my knuckles. This is what keeps me thinking. I'm able to be logical. So that's that front part of the brain. And then here, if I loosen it up here, this is the mid center. That's where you see in red on the right, the amygdala. But this is called the limbic system. This is the emotional center of the brain. And it's important to know those differences because when stress floods our system, when our body perceives there is a threat, then what it does is it tells our brain, stop thinking, we don't need you. You know, there's a hungry tiger in the room, you don't need to think about the hungry tiger, you need to do something. And so it activates the limbic system, the emotional system of the brain, telling you to, either freeze, flee, or fight. I'm not fighting a hungry tiger, are you? I'm not freezing. I am probably running out of the room. Okay? So that's a basic understanding of what's happening. So with burnout, what happens is over time, it's basically, and it's just in little stressors every day. Little thing happens here at 10, little thing happens at 11, a little thing happens, a little disagreement at 12. So throughout the day, these little stresses occur, and because I don't deal with them, they add up, they accumulate over time. Get home at night, and what I do, maybe veg out in front of the TV, or something like that, or I go and I eat a lot, because that makes me feel comforted, because especially eating certain types of foods, release certain types of hormones that make us feel good. And so I'm not taking really care of things as they occur one by one. And day after day, they begin to accumulate. And when they begin to accumulate, then they cause changes in the brain. They cause my amygdala, which is kind of I call it the barking dog, the alarm center. It lets us know when there's danger, but I call it the barking dog. Anybody ever have a dog down the street that's barking and you're like, when are you going to shut that dog up? Right? Middle of the night, 3 in the morning, right? That dog will not shut up. And that's what your amygdala does. It starts barking and barking and barking. And you can't think. You just become a big fat ball of emotions. Anger, fear, whatever. And what is physically happening over time is that amygdala is physically growing. It's getting larger. And in the meantime, the hippocampus, which is kind of where you store memory, you consolidate, it's like the filing cabinet, keeps track of things, it shrinks. It's like having an administrative assistant that forgets to come to work. Okay? Whoops. How are you going to keep track of things now? So it shrinks. But there are also things that go on, and this is why burnout is a big problem. Because over time, as it accumulates, it begins to have an effect on your physical health. Not only your mental health, but your physical health. It can be the cause of hypercortisolism. It can be the cause of diabetes type 2. It can cause you to develop, it can cause you to age faster. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I need to change that, right? It can increase your mortality risk. So a lot of things can happen with burnout. That's why we need to resolve it. And the best way is to prevent it. Now I'm going to tell you something really that's going to surprise you. Because we think, just get away from work. Just take a break. Take a vacation. And I'm not saying those things are bad. Those things are really good. But what we do know for sure is that disengagement is the worst thing you can do to treat burnout. Pulling back, pulling away, isolates you further, prevents you from making the connections you need to make, and increases your degree of burnout. according to the researchers in burnout. Engagement is the key, and I have to find a way to get myself re-engaged. And we're going to get to that part. Is that clock correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Good, I'm right on target with where I want to be. I'm going to show you how to get re-engaged. Okay. So, empathy. Remember I told you, how do we know? How do you know I'm not just playing with words? Because this pretty little picture, it shows us that there is particular areas of your brain when a person is experiencing in green here, that's cognitive empathy. Okay? So, I understand your pain, I'm not feeling it, I understand it. And so you can see that it's experienced in particular areas. Okay, and I'm not going to go into those particular areas necessarily, that's not necessary. I just want you to see that these happen in different areas of the brain. And then let's go to the pink, affective empathy. And you can see over on the right, upper right, you can see at least one area of the upper right, the anterior midcingulate cortex. And then down here, anterior insula. So this is what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this because I find this very interesting. So the insula has an anterior front part and a posterior or back part. So when you're physically or emotionally in pain, the part of your brain that's highlighted or would light up on this machine or a PET scan would be the posterior insula. But when you are able to experience the pain of another person, the anterior insula, the front part of your insula lights up. Fascinating, isn't it? And then compassion, you can see, is in a different part of the brain. So compassion is down here. Okay? Still in the thinking part of the brain, but very, very close to the limbic system, so it can share. Isn't that fascinating? I love science, but not enough to study it that much. But I want you to see that because I think that has some important ramifications for what we do to help ourselves. So this is a good part. This is where I was told to spend more time. So when we talk to people, I say, what do you do to prevent burnout? What do you do to prevent secondary trauma? These are the typical answers I get. More self-care, which means get more sleep, healthy eating, regular physical activity, active relaxation. I am convinced, my doctors have convinced me that the solution to every single problem I've ever had is drink more water, walk more, sleep more. Now that may be true to my physical problems, but I just will let you know self-care alone is not enough. Now if you're not doing it, you do need to do it, but self-care is not enough. Set boundaries, work-life balance. Now I'm going to tell you, I don't like the word work-life balance because that dichotomizes it. That cuts me in half. Like I have one half of me goes to work and one half of me has a life. My work is a large part of my life. Instead, I think of it as a flow. And I flow in and out all day long. So when I get home at night and I get an email from a student, and I may get a text message from a student or an email at 10 o'clock at night, you know what? I don't mind answering it. I don't want to wait till tomorrow to answer it. I just go ahead and answer and get it over and done with. It's taken care of. I don't look at that as that's disrupting my home life. It takes 5 minutes to answer their email. That's okay. Because you know what? At work, there are times when I flow out of work and I'm flowing into my personal life. I'm making a phone call to somebody. I'm having lunch with a friend. I'm doing something that relates to my personal life during the day. So when I began to think of it as a flow, flowing in and out, I became less stressed because I wasn't thinking about it as they're interfering with my home life. And I'm like, maybe not. Now, if I have guests over, we had Tim and his wife over recently, my phone was on silent. And I didn't answer it because that time was focused on my friends. So, here are what the pastors said in that survey. So this is what they said were enlivening to them. And that makes sense. Walking with people during their spiritual journey, having positive relationships, worshiping and fellowshipping, participating in outreach activities, teaching Christian education, preaching, seeing the church grow. It makes all kinds of sense. See, that's where that part of that compassion satisfaction comes in. But I'm going to show you some things, strategies that are based upon neuroscience. We need to work on increasing self-efficacy, increasing self-compassion, and increasing resilience. So let's talk about those. Increasing self-efficacy means I need to learn ways to increase self-regulation. And to do that, I have to have a present awareness of what I'm experiencing throughout the day. Physiologically, if I'm getting tense or not tense. I have to be aware of, in the first thing is called neuroception, that's awareness of safety. Am I physically safe? Versus, am I emotionally safe? I asked my class, undergraduate class yesterday, are you 100% safe in this very second? Not one of them could say they were safe. I said, you are physically safe in this very second. Now, there's a lot of things that could happen in the next second, but it's not happening in this second. You are 100% physically safe in this second. And so neuroception is the ability to detect physical versus emotional safety currently. So I may not feel emotionally safe, but am I physically safe? Right this very second, I'm physically safe. And it's monitoring throughout the day, interoception. Where's my body at? What am I experiencing in my body? And then helping my body to move to parasympathetic recovery easily. Because if I'm tense, that means that my sympathetic nervous system is perceiving that there's some kind of threat, and it may just be a little stressor because that's what it's supposed to pick up on. And I can quickly move myself back to parasympathetic recovery, which is a more relaxed and connected state. See, if you're in sympathetic nervous activation, you don't feel connected to other people. If you're in sympathetic nervous system activation, you will see smiling faces as disapproving. You will see frowning faces as angry. You will see neutral faces as disapproving. But if you can move quickly to parasympathetic recovery, then it'll help. And it only takes 2 seconds, 2 or 3 seconds. So if you will, just for a moment, do this with me. Easy one. Just raise your shoulders up. Just squeeze them a little bit towards your ears, and then just drop them. And what did you notice?
Relaxation.
I felt good, right? Huh? Squeeze your hands tight. Just let go. Yeah. And that's sending a message to your brain. There's not a hungry tiger in the room. Okay? So here's what's interesting. And that took 1 or 2 seconds. But the key is doing it throughout the day. Every time I take a drink of water, I do one. Every time I look at an email, before I look at the email, I do one. Here's another one. I love this one. This is my favorite one because you can do it right here, right now. You can do it anywhere, anytime, and nobody knows you're doing it. And I just call it soften. Soften your face. Soften your eyes. Soften your body. just takes things down a notch. We're not trying to take any anxiety from a 10 to a 1. We're just trying to take it from a 7 to a 6. That's all we're trying to do throughout the day, okay? Monitoring your body, these little things. That builds up over time. So when I do it with clients, the first week they come back and they go, yeah, my anxiety went down from like a 10 to a 9.5. I go, yeah, I know. The second week they come in, they go, okay, well, this week it went down from a 10 to maybe an 8.5. And then they come in. I had a physician who came in, and it was about 2 months, and she said, this is a freaking miracle. I said, no, I know. It's great, isn't it? Because over time, what begins to happen is that barking dog, that amygdala, it shrinks it physically. That hippocampus, the one that's supposed to keep track of your memories and be your storage vault, it grows bigger. It's doing what it's supposed to. It's reversing what took place. So increasing self-care. Here's the one self-care that we know for sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, from research that actually works. And that is exercise. So we know that people who have high burnout rates have higher heart rates and lower heart rate variability. People who don't have burnout have low heart rates and high heart rate variability, which is what we're all supposed to have. So, the answer would be get out and start exercising, except you can't if your brain's shut off, your thinking brain, because it takes your thinking brain to set goals and go out and accomplish those goals. Oh, that's where neuroscience helps us. So, it's kind of like I would if I could. I'd go out and exercise if I could get the impetus to do it. But it will help. And then healthy detachment, like Jesus did, moving quickly from affective empathy to compassion. I see it, I hear it, I feel it, now let me do something. Let's solve, let's see what we can do to resolve the problem or to help you in this moment. What can I do to help? I love it that we have chaplains here today. Thank you, yes sir, I see you. And I love that you're training chaplains, thank you, because I know that you're training them in a way that teaches them to do compassionate work, not just empathy. So, we also need to increase self-compassion. You probably think, well, I think I should have more compassion for others. Here's what the research studies from Stanford University School of Medicine. The more self-compassion you have, the more it increases your compassion for others. The more self-compassion you have in practice, the more it increases your compassion for others. So those of you who are caregivers, this is why it's so important for you to practice self-compassion. Notice I didn't say self-care, because that's hard to get away if you're taking care of a loved one. But self-compassion. And so there is a little self-compassion test you can take if you just look up self-compassion test online. Kristen Neff developed that, and it tells you maybe different areas that you need to work on. There are some self-compassion training, but there's also some self-compassion activities. So I'll tell you about one. There was a study where they had people write 5 days in a row. They just wrote themselves like a paragraph. And that paragraph was from some benevolent source or higher power or God or whomever they wanted to do that just said, hey, I see you, you've done a great job today, and I want to just acknowledge the work that you're doing. So just something positive. Make it as specific as possible, no criticism, nothing negative. They had people do that for 5 days in a row. And of course, they had done a pre-test, they did a post-test, and the people's sense of well-being improved. Now, we would expect that, right? Here's the most interesting part of the study. They went back and did another post-test 6 months later. And they had maintained that higher level of sense of well-being. Oh, wow. Now, what Eric Gentry taught me to do was, it's called a letter from the great supervisor. Yes, and so that was so powerful. And not only did he make us do it, he made us record it and then listen to it ourselves out loud. Now, the first time I did it from God to me. The second time was more powerful because it was from me, Kathy Hoppe, to me. I know God loves me. There's no question about it. But for me to love me and express compassion towards myself was significant. That's what produced a greater change. We also have to increase mindfulness. I know that sometimes that term is controversial. I don't mean it in a controversial way. In the Bible, we have a lot of instances where it talks about Christian meditation, and I really think a lot of it refers to Christian mindfulness, be still and know that I'm God. Be in the present moment, be aware of only but me. And so there is a way that you can kind of test and say, how am I doing? Am I staying in the present moment? Am I getting too far ahead of myself? I love it because Jamie and I were having a conversation earlier, and I asked her what she was going to do when she completed her program. She said, I don't know, that's up to God. And I thought, that's wonderful, I love it. Because, that keeps her in the present moment. Oh, that we would all do that, right? So the last one is increasing resilience. Now, during COVID-19, resilience got a dirty name because so many care providers were being told, you just need to have more resilience, like they didn't have it. They had a ton of resilience. What they did, I happened to teach a bioethics course to nurses online, and some of my nursing students were in New York City. And they told me about the decisions they were having to make. That were life or death decisions about who got respirators and who didn't.
Wow.
And what a tremendous burden. I'm not going to tell them, you just need to have more resilience. I'm not going to say that to them. They have plenty of resilience. They're showing up to work. How? But rather, what I do tell people, think of resilience as if it's a muscle that you can strengthen. Now, I want that. And that means that in the moment, I have to actively process what's going on. I can't wait until tonight. I can't wait until tomorrow. That goes back to that interoception, being aware in the moment what's going on. Whenever I think of actively processing, I can't help but I think of, if those of you who remember Pac-Man, I think of Pac-Man going along his little path, eating all the little dots, and I think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing throughout the day. I'm supposed to be eating all these little stressors and metabolizing them. So in other words, I'm supposed to be keeping my body in a parasympathetic state, bringing it down. Now the other thing is changing the way that I think about things. And this is the harder one. But once I get my body to relax, then it frees my mind to think. And that's when I can look at things from a different perspective, which is what the Bible wants us to do, right? As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So that's when we can really begin to view stressors in a different way. And if you ever get the chance, I encourage you to look at Kelly McGonigal's TED Talk on how to make stress your friend. Because it will help change your perspective about stress and recognize that stress can be a good thing to a point. It can motivate us, it can get us up and doing what we wouldn't do before. But also, maybe I can realize that a system may not change, but I can change. I can change my approach. I can change my view. Okay? So I can use those types of cognitive skills. And I can increase my compassion satisfaction dealing with either my burnout or secondary trauma through creating a career-sustaining narrative. And in the last few minutes, I'm going to tell you how to do that. And I'm going to tell you, this is the one thing that brought me out of burnout and compassion. was doing this. Because when I first entered this field, I thought, I'm gonna help people. I'm gonna fix people. Yeah, I really thought that. I was young and naive. I believed I could do that. Except when I started seeing people, I didn't know if I helped them or not. No. And so how could I know that? And so how could I know if I was successful or not? Should I continue in this work? Should I not? And I had to come to the point where I realized I had to come up with a different way of viewing things, and this is how I did it. So first of all, I had to kind of look at my value system. What's really important to me? Is it being known? No. What's really important to me? Authenticity, integrity, honesty, hope. Those are the sorts of things that were important to me. So I had to choose my values. And then I had to look at what situations in which I breached these. And what caused me to breach those? What were the triggers? And then I had to write a covenant. That was too long, so I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. And I simplified it to one statement. So here's a list of values. Anytime you can look up any list of values online. So I tell people, choose 2, 3 of these. Now, which do you believe are the most important to you? And you can do this with people that you work with. Which of these values are most important to you? I don't want you to tell me what's important, what you think is important to me. Which values are most important to you? And once you identify 3 of those, then you think, yesterday, did I live up to those values? That's who I aim to be. Did I live up to it? And usually the answer is not 100%. That's pretty human. So, if I didn't, then what got in my way? See, I don't go, yeah, you're a bad person. You didn't live up to your values. No, I go, what got in your way? What prevented you from living up to your values 100% yesterday? And then, from that I wrote a covenant. But like I said, and the covenants, focuses on the best of me and what inspires me and covers my roles, etc. And I wrote this 1-page covenant, and I have it somewhere, but it's too long to read. In the moment when I most need it, it's too much to read. I'm not a TikTok kind of gal, but I like things brief. Okay? Give it to me, give it to me in Instagram fashion. Be bold, be brief, be gone, right? So I had to simplify it. So I simplified mine because no longer was I here to fix people. I changed it to, I am here to witness suffering. To walk with those who suffer and point the way to hope and healing. Here's the most beautiful thing I discovered about shortening my covenant to this simple statement. I am 100% successful every single day. I do this every day. I cannot fail at this. What a change. But in the moment when I'm seeing people and I'm distracted, or maybe I'm bored, or something else is going on, I had to shorten it, especially when I was doing online therapy, because I really got distracted doing online therapy. So I thought, okay, I gotta shorten this. So I just reminded myself, what does this whole thing say? I am a witness. So when I found myself pulling my chair back away from the computer and distracted, I go, you're a witness. If I'm a witness, I gotta pay attention. If I felt myself bored, I'm a witness. I need to be curious about what this person's saying. If I'm at work, I'm feeling burned out. I'm a witness. I gotta pay attention to things. That re-engages me like I need to be re-engaged. And then you update it as needed. Now, I'm not gonna say I've settled on this because I don't know that I really like it, but I thought, well, I do a little bit more than counseling now, so I tried to update it. I don't know that I like this one as much though. I like the first one better. Nonetheless, I am a witness still fits. I am a witness every single day, 100% of the time. So I hope that you can adapt and find one that you like. So going back to Isaiah, I love this because I think that it addresses what we experience in burnout or secondary trauma. When you feel dried up and worthless, God will nourish you and give you strength. And you will grow like a garden lovingly tended. You will be like a spring whose water never runs out. Oh, just let that fall on you like the fresh dew. Thank you. Any questions?
Question mark. Does it get any better?
No.
Kathy, thank you. Thank you. God be with you today on that appointment. 4 things quick before you go. First of all, big thank you for being here this morning. And I can't imagine you didn't find it of worth. If I were to ask you, but you don't have to raise your hands, in many a context, if you are given to continuing education opportunities, keep your hands down but ask and answer. That had been worth at least $100. So we didn't charge, and Bright Tomorrows never charges. But you will see an offering envelope, and we do not twist arms. But if you're have the ability to do something to help us keep these things going, there's an envelope that makes that option available to you. Number 3, there are eval forms. We would appreciate you filling those out. And then I would like to introduce to you our April presenter. Jeanette McCormick is the author of Art of Being You, Breaking the Anxiety Cycle. I have been reading this book, and it's so well worth your while to read it as well. She'll be our April 25th presenter. She presents on trauma or training, growing up in an anxious world. Jeanette happens to be here this morning. Would you stand, Jeanette, so we can meet and greet you? This is Jeanette. So be sure to be back. God bless you. Have a great day. If you want to pick up a banana or something, go ahead and do it.